Every Monday, we take a closer look at what your elected officials are up to, and now legislators in Des Moines have finished this year's session. So we're going to recap the bills that made it and the ones that didn't. Here to help break things down for us is Dana Searles of our sister station WOI in Des Moines. Dana, we have a lot to get to today. Before we get to all the bills that have passed and either are now law or on the governor's desk, let's start with the bills that didn't. There's a whole lot of them.
Yeah, so I want to start talking about the bill known as the Right to Repair bill. It's a bill a lot of farmers had their eyes on that would require agricultural equipment manufacturers to make all of their software tools, data, etc. available to independent farmers and independent dealers at a fair and reasonable cost. But this one ultimately did not go through. I want to bring to note a few other bills that did not pass. First one that would implement dress code requirements to some of Iowa's public schools. Another one that would ban DEI offices or diversity, equity, and inclusion offices in private universities, a bill that would allow firearms and vehicles on school grounds, a bill to increase Iowa's tobacco tax, and also an effort to bring the Chicago Bears to Iowa. But two other major bills that did not make it through. One that we had our eyes on, that bill would have banned any material related to gender identity and sexual orientation for K through 12 students. That did not go through. Another bill was the bill to ban eminent domain for the use of building carbon capture pipelines. But those are just a few of the bills that did not make it through this legislative session.
All right, so let's turn to some bills that did pass. Can you start with some of the funding bills?
Yeah, so we talked about last week that final property tax relief bill that made it through the legislature. So the biggest thing you need to know, like we mentioned last week, in that property tax bill is a 2% hard cap on local government revenue growth. But there were still a number of other funding bills that made it through in the final few months of the legislative session. So the first is actually a constitutional amendment. So now Iowans will vote yes or no on this. Any bill that would involve raising the state's income tax, lawmakers would be required to get a supermajority vote, which typically requires working across the aisle. Some other funding bills that passed. One is a premium tax increase on health maintenance organizations from 0.925% to 3.5%. What exactly an HMO is basically like your health insurance. Those are the biggest ones that'll impact you directly.
Well, speaking of bills that will impact people directly, we talked about a lot of health-related bills this year. Some didn't pass, but what were some that did make it to Governor Reynolds' desk?
The biggest one is Governor Reynolds' bill known as the Make America Healthy Again bill that adds restrictions to SNAP recipients and what they can buy with their SNAP benefits. It adds bans various food dyes from schools. It limits screen time for students, and it also adds more physical education when it comes to Iowa's schools. Another big thing in this bill is it allows Iowans to buy ivermectin over the counter. That was a pretty controversial point in that bill, but that entire bill, it does a lot of different things. That ultimately is on Governor Reynolds' desk. Some other health-related bills include they allocated $25 million to bring upgrades to hopefully address Iowa's water quality crisis. Another bill, any new built homes in the state, they would now be required to install passive radon mitigation systems. Iowa has some of the highest rates of radon in the country. Another thing that moved through is an increase in taxes on vape products. But that money from the taxes, that'll go towards pediatric cancer research. Another bill that passed, it expands access to subacute mental health care, removing the 10-day limit on care. Another bill is requiring a parent to approve a minor getting the HPV vaccine. Another big bill that would require anybody seeking abortion medication to go to a doctor in person, and the doctor would be required to give that person an exam before they can dispense that abortion medication.
We've talked about health, we've talked about funding. There were also a lot of policy bills that were passed this year. What were some of the big ones?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ones, we saw this actually very early on in the legislative session. It banned local governments from adding protections for things like gender identity or civil rights protections for things like that that would be broader than Iowa code. Another few big things that we saw, a bill requiring public employees to use E-Verify or the SAVE system to confirm work authorization. Another bill we saw passed would limit the governor's emergency powers. We saw a lot of controversy with that, considering that we do have an open governor's race. Another bill would require English-only tests for commercial driver's licenses. Another bill requires Iowa HHS to verify immigration status for SNAP and WIC recipients. And then finally, a bill allowing foster parents to raise a child consistent with their beliefs. So those are the big ones that I think we've talked about all session that we saw push through.
And before I let you go, the GOP has been touting some of the so-called tough on crime bills that they passed this legislative session. What do these bills say?
The first one is probably the biggest one that we saw. It would implement a 3-strike system. So that means that 3-time felony offenders would be required to face at least 7 years in prison. Another bill that's actually being signed into law today would make animal torture in the state of Iowa a felony. And then finally, a bill on the governor's desk would also ban warrant resolution clinics in the state. So those are just a few of the bills that we talked about. But the biggest one is probably that 3-strike system that would be implemented for repeat felony offenders.
Dana, we saw Republicans hold a supermajority for most of the session. Even when they lost the supermajority in the Senate, they still had far and away the majority, and they controlled all 3 branches in the government here in Iowa. So did the GOP accomplish all of the tasks they wanted to this year?
You know, I think they always go into the end of session, and obviously there are certain things that I'm sure they would have loved to see pass and get done. But the big consensus that we did see from Iowa GOP, whether it was the House, the Senate, or Governor Reynolds, they all were very proud of getting property tax relief across the finish line.
And that brings up the question, how did Democrats feel about what passed this session?
Democrats were very much just a sigh of relief that it was over, and just kind of looking ahead to the midterm primaries and midterm elections, because it'll be very closely watched kind of what happens in terms of majority in the Senate and the House, as well as especially what happens in the governor's race to see what party will ultimately control the governor's seat. But yep, common consensus among Democrats was just a sigh of relief that the session was over and just looking ahead to those midterms.
Well, Dana, you have spent a lot of time with us, breaking things down for us every Monday. Thank you so much for your time and for being here with us week after week. And for you guys at home, we have our political coverage for both states up on our website underneath the As Seen on TV tab at the top of the homepage.